Welcome to this month's Intro to Admissions Counseling session for PNACAC. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Palmer Muntz, and I am one of the co-chairs for professional development for the Pacific Northwest Association for College Admissions Counseling. I'm joined by Ray Pepley, who is my co-chair. And this month, our topic is territory management. And I will say personally, I'm looking forward to this. As you can tell, I've been doing this a long time, but I think there's just so many new aspects to learn. And I was saying a few minutes ago before everyone logged in, I'm sure there's a few things I'm going to pick up. I'm excited. So Erin Jensen is our presenter for this topic. Erin has been in the admissions world for about 15 years, and formerly was at Western Washington University and Portland State University, was the director of admissions at Washington State University, Vancouver, and now is transitioning into being an independent educational consultant. And I know she's got some other irons in the fire too. Erin's always got something going on. She also is our tech chair for PNACAC. So she's always almost part of these webinars because she keeps us functioning. Thank you, Erin. And this summer, she'll be one of our co-chairs for Summer Institute. And I just want to plant the seed with you right now. We'll be putting out the dates and more information very soon. But for especially those of you who are in your first couple of years in the profession, coming to Summer Institute, it'll be at University of Portland, might be a fantastic way to build a good foundation for your career. And with that said, I'll get out of Erin's way. We'll let her get going. Feel free to use the Q&A to put any questions that you'd like to have addressed, and we will cover them either during or at the end of the presentation. But thanks for doing this for us, Erin. Take it away.
Thanks, Palmer. And I've got a few other things I'll say about conversations that Palmer and I had about this session too. I consider him one of the contributors to this session, so he's being modest. So I'll reintroduce myself. My name is Erin Jensen. I use she, her pronouns. And as Palmer said, I've been in the world of admissions and recruitment for about 15 years, a little over 15 years. And the topic of territory management is a really important one to me. I'm passionate about it because while I did do training, I went to the original College Board based new admissions counselor boot camp. I did great training with my colleagues as a new admissions counselor. I never received any training on territory management. No one ever defined it for me, told me how to do it. It was one of those things I've had to learn along the way. So I'm very passionate about making sure that new admissions counselors understand this critical piece of the recruitment side of what they do. And really, it's going to come down to the relationships that you create with, you'll see relationships come up a lot in this session, the relationships you create with your students, with your colleagues, and ultimately how you learn this, this craft of what we do. You'll see that visually here, I've gone with a theme. And that is because I really do feel that managing territories is like cultivating a garden. It is both an art and a science. There's data you can look at, you can measure things, you can experiment with things, but ultimately, as some of you probably have already experienced, you can't always control it. And there's a lot of art and finessing that goes along with it. So I kind of am using some analogies here to get your brain thinking about this gardening analogy that I'm using here. So the soil is sort of like this a student's school or the locale that they're in, the environment, the world that they live in. The seeds are their sort of discovery of your institution. You're planting those seeds as you go into their schools, meet them at college fairs, etc. That fertilizer is that ongoing communication, the outreach that you're doing with them, with the families that you're meeting with, the school staff that you're meeting with, and kind of that ongoing nurturing of relationships. Those weeds are those barriers to applying. So it could be fears or anxiety around applying or getting admitted, could be financial barriers, it could be environmental barriers. A lot of those weeds start to creep in as we get through the cycle, and we have to be conscious of those and make sure we know how to remove them along the way and get past them. And then weather, I like to throw this one in there because there's always external factors that impact our ability to keep those seeds growing. And sometimes they're predictable, especially if we're looking at a lot of data and trends. But in many ways, we know, as we learned through COVID, they're not always predictable. So those sort of environmental factors that we have to be aware of as we go, all of these things come together, and ultimately it helps. The more you know about these things, the more I think you'll feel confident in the way that you can shape the garden, the pool of applicants that you're working with. And so the one thing I wanted to pause here and say that Palmer made a point as we were looking through the notes for this, that this can seem really overwhelming at first, but I think the more you have this terminology and this information in your back pocket, the more you're going to start to see how you can use more sophisticated questions, data analysis, and concepts as you start working in different territories, continue on in this field. So with that, I've tried to keep this session fairly straightforward. I have pages of notes that I've collected from other folks, and I will be sharing a handout with everyone after this session, as well as the slides. So you'll have a much longer list of things like questions to ask and data to consider after this session, but this is meant to be just really introductory. First, I want to run a poll though. And so I want to get a sense of who's here. I know we have a small group, but I'd love to get an idea of who I'm talking to today. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the poll and give you a few minutes to answer that. I've got 3 questions. All right. Should be able to answer those. All right. So 63% of our attendees, this is their first time recruiting. Yay, congratulations. And then we've got some veterans in the room as well. Looks like most folks here are all actually with 4-year institutions, public or private. And oh, we've got some regional folks. Fantastic. So actually a little more than half of the people here are regional. Everyone else is campus-based. All right. So let me share those results so you can all see those. Okay. Thank you for doing that. I'll have another poll coming up here in a little bit. So first, what we're going to cover today is really just 4 big concepts. I want to go over the definitions to center the terminology that we use around territory management and to be aware of some different ways that people refer to territory management out there. Might be one of your institutions. We want to talk a little bit about the importance, like why do we even care about territory management? Why does it matter in the work that we do? And then we'll get into the sort of questions to ask along the way to help you home in on the type of work you want to be doing in each of your territories. Finally, you want to know where to get the answers to those questions, right? So we'll talk about some of the tools that you can use to get data, to get information, and to help yourself stay more organized and confident as you continue on in your territory management. So first of all, what is territory management? What do we mean when we say that? I think this is one of those phrases that gets thrown around in admissions offices, and we don't always have the same definition. I think some people who've been doing this longer might have a different definition than those of you who are new. And so when I really sat down and thought about what this means to me, at least in an academic standpoint, I would using all the big words here. It is the unique strategies, relationships, and the data analysis that you utilize to effectively recruit students from defined populations. And we'll get into what populations might mean there. Colloquially, though, I just say it's how you decide how and where you spend your time recruiting students. You obviously have limited time, budget, time of the year, time in the day. And so you really do need to make decisions about what you do with the students that you're meeting, and how you foster those relationships. And so that's ultimately what territory management is. As we dig deeper, it's going to seem more complex, but remember, that's what we're talking about. It's a pretty straightforward concept. When we say territories, we are typically referring to a mix of, in some schools, a geographic region. It might be a whole state or a series of states. It might be zip codes. It might be a city. A lot of times, because travel is involved, it's a geographic territory or region. That's another term that other institutions use. It might also be populations, though. So it could sometimes be demographic population, maybe students of color, maybe Latinx students, maybe first-generation students. Sometimes a staff member is assigned to work with a mix of both of those. So maybe first-generation students within the city limits where you are working. It can also be referred to as caseloads, although that's typically a term used in more of like a high school side. But any of those terms are really referring to the same sort of thing. And then there's some weird ones out there too. For a while, I actually managed private high schools in the Portland area. And when I worked at Western Washington, I managed private high schools in the Seattle area. That's not really, I mean, it's geographic kind of, but it's also a type of school. So there really are different ways to define territories, but typically that's what we mean when we say territory. Groups of students who meet some sort of similar criteria. When we say strategies, this is where I think it's important to remember that strategies are really based on the actions that you're taking. So these are intentional tactics or decisions to take action or not to take action, based on definitely those institutional priorities. You probably already know what those are at this point, or at least what some of them are. Your own professional judgment, and the more you have experience in this area, the more professional judgment you can use for those strategies. And then your informed guesses, and that's kind of where data analysis comes in. You're going to be making some guesses around, well, I think students here might be more interested in this major or in our institution because of X, Y, and Z, because I've done my research. And so that's really where those informed guesses and professional judgment comes into play. When we talk about relationships, this is pretty obvious, I think, but internal and external to your institution. We'll see some examples of that here soon. Remember, this is both with professionals in the field, in schools, your coworkers, financial aid counselors, so many people who are in the professional side of the work we do, but it's also this obviously relationships with students and their families. And so some of these relationships may already exist in territories that you're responsible for. Maybe somebody before you had already kind of created them and nurtured them. But remember, you're also still responsible for doing the same thing and nurturing and creating new relationships yourself. That's a big part of our life. And then data analysis, when we say this, we're really talking about asking specific questions and getting the answers to them. So if you're asking the right questions and you're looking at the right data, you're going to get the right answers. And so you really want to be looking at reliable facts and figures, making sure you are finding the true source of truth, and then using historical or current trends. So sometimes you'll be looking at what happened in the past. As we know with COVID, again, that doesn't always mean that's going to be the same thing that happens in the future, but worth looking at. And you can potentially project or predict future trends based on data analysis, and that can change those strategies, right? So the next question becomes, why is all of this important? Kind of touched on that a little bit, but the question, it's kind of a silly question, but why not just do the same thing everywhere? Why not just go to every single high school or every single community college in your state and talk to the same students about the same things? And why even assign different territories to specific staff members? Why not just have everybody kind of pick and choose where they want to go any time of day? So why is territory management, based on what we just talked about, important? So I'm actually going to open another poll, and so exciting as of now, if you haven't figured this out yet, Zoom actually allows polls to have open-ended questions. This is in the last few weeks. So I'm going to ask you to fill out some open-ended questions, or a open-ended question. And I want to see what sort of fun stuff you come up with. Why do you think it's important to know how to manage your territory? So let me get that up. Okay. I'll give you a few seconds. This might take you a little bit to type things in. And I'm gonna look at my notes. We've got one response so far. Oh, two. Don't feel shy. You can put lists of words. Yes, they can be simple. Thank you, Palmer. No need to write a whole paragraph. Nice. Okay. Heard from 5 of you so far. I think for the sake of time, I am going to, I'm going to end the poll in a second, but if you've already started typing something, you haven't hit send yet, copy it and drop it in the chat. You know, if you haven't had a chance to share it in this poll, I'm still interested to hear what you think. And I'm sure everyone else would love to see that too. All right. Oh, here we go. This is the first time I've done this, so take a look. All right, so different populations might need access to different types of information and resources, absolutely. Knowing who you serve, knowing your audience, we'll get to that for sure. Oh, organizing schedules in the same area, yes. You don't want to be driving too far. Meaningful and authentic interactions, I love that. Brand identity and the funnel. Mm-hmm. Yeah, not every school is the same. Absolutely. Not every student is the same. Not every high school is the same. And definitely relating to students. Yeah. Y'all know this stuff. I love it. Okay, let me go back into my slideshow. Fantastic. Okay, so kind of heard through some of these things. And I think that the point is really what you all were saying is that's just like College Fit, recruitment strategies are not one size fits all. So, you know, this enrollment behavior that students exhibit is really going to be influenced by all of these complex factors, the high schools, the types of students, the resources they need, the interactions that you have with them. And so all of these things can be, there's all these influencers, right? It's important because we have to manage institutional priorities. We talked about that. Geographic and demographic differences. Those are kind of two really big ones. But what else is in there? Legislative and policy changes. Don't forget that, right? So sometimes there are, in some states, especially if you work for a public institution, there might be mandates to increase a certain number of in-state students or to award state funding differently. And so that might change the way that you're recruiting students. So sometimes it's at more of this larger state or regional political level. Historical trends, we have to be aware of those, right? So knowing what the economics in an area have been, knowing what the yield has been from certain schools, you have to understand that and be able to move forward as you project changes, right? You obviously need to build and maintain relationships. And so understanding how to use all of these factors to build and maintain relationships is important. You want to keep up the reputation of your school. Somebody mentioned that in their responses, and be aware of what that reputation is in different places. And media and current events. We all know how that has impacted the way that certain schools, your institution, maybe just college in general, right? And the public perception of higher education. Knowing how to relate to and talk about these things in your interactions with students, families, and counselors, you kind of have to know how to do that in different locations with different types of people. So there's so many different things that are impacting why territory management is important. And ultimately, you want to recruit students, right? You want to see students go to college, and you want to help your institution, you know, enroll the students that you think are the best fit. So it really gives you the opportunity to adjust your actions based on those. So as you're thinking about all these things that are important and the factors that are involved here, the questions to ask are going to be really important as you start visiting schools, continuing to do that, starting to research, look at data. Ultimately, right here at the top, where should you spend your limited time and resources? That is the question you're trying to answer. There's all these sub questions underneath it, but that's the big one that you're always trying to answer with territory management. And so this, in many cases, comes down to some big things here that are related to your institution. So what are your institutional or office goals? Does your office even have enrollment goals? Do they have goals based on school, based on geography, demographics? Those are obviously things that will very much guide what you do. And so having the answers to that question is very important. When you know that answer, though, it's important to understand, are you maintaining particular markets, be that a school or a demographic? You just want to keep it steady. Or are you trying to grow in a new area? So for example, when I worked at Portland State, oh gosh, this is definitely pre-pandemic, we were really interested in growing in the northeastern part of the United States. And so I did some sort of exploratory recruitment out in Boston, New York, parts of the country that you wouldn't necessarily think a ton of people would be coming over to Portland, Oregon, but let's explore it. Let's see if we can grow that market. There seemed to be some historical trends of people enrolling from there. And so that's an example of growth in a specific market that's geographic, but it might also mean, hey, we are seeing a decrease in men enrolling in college. How can we do more work in bringing in more applicants who identify as male? Excuse me. So that can mean a lot of different things, a lot of different schools. And then, especially if you're an alum, you probably already know the answer to this, but it always changes. What types of students are most likely to enroll? Who are those low-hanging fruit students or the feeder schools that you are used to seeing students apply from? What is your bread and butter demographic? If you understand that, and maybe even where that needs to change moving forward, that's going to inform how you change your tactics, your territory management. Next, it's really important to think about what life is like for students in different parts of your territories. So I'm trying to be inclusive here of not just schools necessarily, but demographics, maybe types of schools. What are students likely to be interested in or involved in? How can you relate that to the majors and student life on your campus? What are they likely to be concerned about or distracted by? I've worked with a lot of inner city schools where college is not necessarily on the top of students' radar when they are focused on serving their families, staying safe, staying healthy. And so how can you change your tactics and your communication strategies based on that? And then how can, obviously, that inform your conversations, and how do you find the resources that students need and ways that they will relate to you and be interested in your institution and ultimately thrive at your institution. And so I included a little quote here from Kelly Talbert at Boise State, one of our contributors. I encourage you, if you haven't yet, to see if you can get notes from folks who've already worked in your territories. A lot of this sort of thing is not data specific. You can't look at data about what sort of what's life like, right? You can, but it's not really going to give you the whole picture. And so if you have some of those harder to pin down details, as Kelly says, from other folks, that can give you tons of insight into how to have conversations with students, or even when to visit, how often to visit, how you communicate with them by text, by email. Is calling even worth it? All sorts of things you can do differently. Relationships, obviously, I keep honing in on this, but where does your institution already have strong relationships? Where do you already have strong relationships? And why? So an example of this in my experience, I grew up in Boise, Idaho, and Ray knows this well. And so when I first started doing recruitment, my office, thank you, Western Washington, assigned me to the state of Idaho because I already had relationships with folks in the Boise area. I could relate to students based on the fact that I was from the same state as them. I knew the region already. There's a lot of relationships that come along with that lived experience you might already have. But I've also been responsible for international students from countries I've never visited. So you obviously want to be looking at ways that you can nurture and strengthen some of those existing relationships, build new ones, and can you leverage them for building new relationships, learning more things? What sort of partnerships could you potentially create? Do you know somebody who works at a community-based organization in the same area who could potentially partner with you and provide some additional, say, financial aid assistance at schools that you're visiting? So finding those connections along the way can be incredibly important, but you need to ask that question. And then Palmer brought this up to me too, because I didn't really always have access to a budget, but it's a worthwhile question to ask. What is my budget? Or do I even have one? Does the office have a budget? How autonomous am I in actually getting to make decisions about where I visit, how long I'm there, what sort of events I can put on in that area based on budgetary decisions. Most likely first year, second year admissions counselors don't have a whole lot of autonomy, but if you're asking these questions now and learning the answers to them, you are going to find yourself moving into higher level roles sooner, I can pretty much guarantee you. So knowing the budget is very important. And then I think it's important we know all these great things that are going on, but we also need to know the challengers. What are things that are making it hard for us to recruit in certain territories? And why? Is it any of those factors that we've just covered? Can they be addressed in a strategic way? Can you perhaps create partnerships or develop new programming or communication methods that don't necessarily come at it head to head, but are maybe strategically thinking of ways that maybe your reputation might be a challenge in a certain area, or maybe those barriers that we talked about that students are facing are a challenge. How do you come at that strategically? So an example that I can think of from my experience, when I started working for Western Washington University, and I was recruiting in the Portland area in Oregon, someone told me who had more experience recruiting in that area that because of the state public institution structures, so the public universities in Washington are structured differently than in Oregon, the name Western Washington University, while it is one of the few universities in the state of Washington that is a little bit more selective at the time, that might not necessarily translate as well to someone who might be comparing it to Western Oregon University, which is one of the regional institutions in Oregon. So there are these different definitions that folks in different states have based on what they're used to in their state compared to maybe what institution you're at, right? And so thinking about how can we talk about Western Washington University as close to an urban area, whereas in Oregon, a lot of the regionals are in more rural areas. How do you have that conversation, right? And then what is the institutional appetite for reallocating your time or your budget if you feel you do need to make changes in the way you manage your territory based on those challenges? Do you need to visit new areas? Is one of the challenges your own safety? I have worked with colleagues who do not feel safe in certain areas, and that's a worthwhile conversation to have too. That might change your territory management. It might change the way you approach where you stay, where you visit. So be aware of those things and ask those questions as you go. Now, how to answer those questions, I'm going to get to next. I'm actually going to skip back here. And I'm going to say, I actually have a much longer list of questions to ask that my colleagues and I came up with. I did not want to overwhelm you with it all today. And so those more in-depth questions are going to be in the handout that I send to you all and make available with this recording. But I wanted to pull out some of these big ones that are worth thinking about now, especially this early on in a recruitment cycle. If you can get answers to some of these questions in November, you will probably feel a lot more secure in what you're doing in February or April with yield season and helping students make decisions. But there's some other stuff in here that can get more into the weeds of questions you could ask. And believe me, these questions are never ending. You'll continue thinking of questions to ask as you continue on in this field, and they change over time. So these are the big basic ones though. So how do we answer these questions though, right? I've touched on some of this already, but to give you some more specifics, data is going to be your friend. And it's one of the tools that I'll talk about here in a second. But the data that you'll probably want to be looking at to answer these questions are application trends within your institution. And one of my colleagues, Andrea, pointed out, you have to remember COVID as a little blip in there. Same thing with past visit or event trends. So looking at where you've visited or where your institution has visited in the past versus put on events, maybe events on campus. What sort of data can you glean about schools and cities? What demographics are you aware of in those areas? So if you need to know what the demographics are of a school that you've never visited before, a lot of that information is available, but you need to know to go look for it. Financial aid data is huge, right? Any of you who've been working with students in the last year know that there is so much anxiety around financial aid, and with everything changing this year, knowing who those students are who are potentially Pell eligible. In the state of Washington, there are, that's where I most recently have worked, there are some very specific financial aid grants and scholarship programs that are also data points that you could look at. You know where a lot of those students go to school, know how to provide those resources to those students. Looking at enrollment trends at nearby institutions or peer institutions, like your competitors or schools that are similar to yours, that might tell you a lot about the behavior of students coming into your institution. And again, a lot of that data is out there. Also helpful to get relationship information from relationships, right? A lot of that stuff is exchanged as you're at college fairs or get to know people. And then obviously legislation and policy changes. And I will put a plug here for PNACAC in particular. We have a fantastic advocacy committee that is really great at keeping our PNACAC members aware of legislation and policy changes in our region. And so being up on potential changes or recent changes is going to help you predict some of those changes in the future as you go into school, say next year. If you're just now finding out that there's a new version of the FAFSA, learn about it, right? That's fine, but these are the sort of things that some of us have known about for 3-4 years. And so if you can predict those changes moving forward, you can start thinking about how to change your territory management. And then the people that you can talk to and get answers to some of these questions, this is where networking comes into play. This is where PNACAC comes into play, right? Getting to know some of your coworkers, your colleagues, both on the high school side and in your peer level of other admissions counselors, your coworkers within your office. Ask them some of these questions and see what they say. See if you get the same answers from the same people. You probably won't. Sometimes you will, but not always. Start making friends, as I'm sure many of you have on the road, and start asking some of these questions of your colleagues. And school counselors, as you visit new and different schools, they are going to be some of the best friends that you can make on the road because they are there day in and day out with their students, right? They know them very well. And in many cases, principals and district leaders do too. And they can often give you a little more information about the politics at play as to why maybe certain schools are willing to let you visit any time of day versus only at lunch, right? So some of those things can be more political at different levels. And then I really encourage you to get to know folks at your areas, community-based organizations, your CBOs, and other community partners, because they can be fantastic advocates for your students, partners, and they have a lot of information as well, similar to school counselors, of working with students on a regular basis that you might not have if you only visit that area once or twice a year. So creating those relationships can be a great place to find answers to those questions. And then your experience is a really big part of answering questions too, right? Getting to know your audience, understanding the sort of culture or values of a particular geographic area or school, understanding how that ties into the fit of your institution is going to give you so much knowledge in how you change the conversations you have with students and how you can support them better. Knowing and observing their interest level or the knowledge of your institution. So if you go to a college fair and you really don't feel like students are interested in your institution or they're not really aware of it, or the questions that they're asking tell you that maybe their college readiness is different than another institution where they might be asking about graduation rates for your graduation rates versus do you have a specific major? Those sort of questions can tell you a little bit more about college readiness in a school and where you can make an impact. Same thing with parent interactions, right? So a lot of times the way that you interact with parents in, let's say, I'll say private institution, with a lot of private independent high schools, those parents can often be very different in how they interact with you and the sort of questions they might have, or the frequency in which they ask you those questions, than sort of the general populace of many other parents who might be first generation parents themselves. They may not have gone to college, and knowing how you can provide resources is part of that, right? Pay attention to the responsiveness and the interactions with school contacts, counselors, the receptionists, folks at the front desk. If there is any reason why you feel like that school loves your institution, or maybe they don't really love colleges coming in general, take that information, store it away, and find ways to change that relationship. The organization or logistics or visits or fairs, huge, right? That's an area where I think a lot of partnership between high school counselors and high school staff and college recruiters can come together and say, hey, we need to maybe come up with one college fair instead of 5 high schools doing different college fairs on different days, different weeks. So that can help change your territory management. And as I mentioned earlier, your personal comfort. That's something I think is very valid and probably not something that's been talked about in a lot of offices. Andrea from Seattle University says that she recommends having sort of a real quick, here's who's a good fit for our school, or if you're more selective, here's who we expect to be admissible. Share that with counselors so that they understand who they can send to your institution as a potential fit. And that really comes into that knowing your audience piece, right? Okay, finally, tools to find your answers. Again, we have so much information to share with you, specific data points and suggestions, but to just go over the basics here, data is your friend. Looking at your own institutional enrollment reports, things like year-over-year application trends, yield data, where have you changed over time, notes from past cycles. It is amazing what you will forget after not having been somewhere for a year. Make your own notes if you don't already have them from someone else. I will always forget where the entrance is to a high school if I've only been there once, right? So put that in your notes. Put notes in there if you feel like a school needs specific resources. Refer back to it later. Finding more of the sort of big institutional research things like IPEDS, the federal data warehouse can tell you a lot about schools and demographics. Same with state boards of education, school districts, or schools themselves. School rankings, I put this on here, but everyone who put it on my list said, with caution, understand that school rankings are problematic in many ways. So use those with caution. May be important in some areas to change your relationships. Census data tells you a lot about who's living where, population growth, demographics, and making friends with your CBOs. They've got great information too. If you can get data in a spreadsheet, learn how to build a pivot table. That will get you some amazing information. So you're not just looking at tons of numbers. You can find ways to slice and dice some of this stuff and get really quick answers. So that's my little pro tip in there for data. In terms of calendars, obviously you've already been looking at lots of calendars, but remember that if there are new events, schools, or activities that are on the docket for this next year, user relationships. I hear that there's a college fair coming up at this school in the next few weeks. Have you ever done that one before? Ask that question of someone at a college fair or one of your visits who might be a similar school to you. They're probably going to have some really good insight. Knowing what the key dates are for schools, holidays, closures, PSAT testing days, open and close dates, graduation dates, that can help you plan your territory management. Knowing your own institutional events and how to plan around those, as well as expectations, like how many visits can you actually do in a day? What's even feasible in what's feasible in one territory versus another? When I recruited in Southern California, in many cases, because of the traffic, it was almost impossible for me to get to more than 2 high schools in a day, maybe 3. If I had a college fair in the evening, maybe 2, right? And so that's a little bit different than recruiting in Boise, Idaho, although the traffic's getting bad there too. But that can really change. And if you have expectations in your office of you must have 3 high school visits a day, know that. Same thing if you need to be in the office a certain amount of time, or if you're okay with being out for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, which I do not recommend. but that might be an expectation in your office. Be aware of that. Maps are huge, obviously. Finding answers to how you can manage your territory. One of you said this in your answer here, is understanding how to group things together is huge. My pro tip for this: use Google Maps either on your phone or the google.com/maps, and you can actually save all of the schools that you are visiting. You can map the distance between the two, and then when you get in your car, you can just click it and go there. So finding ways to map out locations and use your time as wisely as possible is huge. And then finally, I'm going to say it a million times, relationships. So talking to people, coworkers, the students who you're meeting with, the school staff, and then of course your colleagues. It's kind of why PNACAC is great, or other institutions like Arrow. Those of you who are regional, if you are not already part of Arrow, the regional recruitment group, you should be. Great place to find answers and ask questions. So with that, you will have more information to dig into soon. I want to give special thanks to this amazing group of colleagues who reviewed all of these topics and gave some amazing suggestions and things that I hadn't even thought of or forgot. You really do have an amazing group of knowledgeable experts in PNACAC, and I encourage you to continue using them as you learn more about this field. The relationships, again, that I've built within PNACAC have, I think, kept me in this field as long as I've been in it, because I'm always learning from people. And it's helped me learn about territory management along the way, because no one ever taught me. So thanks to all of these folks here. And I will share everything with you a little bit later, but thank you for coming to this session. I'm going to hand it back to Palmer, and would love to have a bit of time for Q&A. I didn't see any Q&A come in, but
No, I didn't.
happy to answer.
There haven't been any questions yet that were posted, but I actually have a question, and
Okay.
maybe this can start, some other questions that might come up. You mentioned CBOs and other community organizations. Do you have any tips for how to identify where they are and which community-based organizations are worth engaging with?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Palmer. I think this is where you can rely on, again, colleagues who might have already recruited in that area. Great question to ask them. But a lot of times high school counselors are aware of CBOs that are already doing work in their schools. So for example, when I worked in Vancouver's high schools, I learned about an organization called Fourth Plane Forward, which is not a national organization. It's obviously regional, but it's an amazing powerhouse of local folks who are working with students on the fourth plane in Vancouver, which is a pretty high need area of Vancouver. And I learned about them through TRIO, through the TRIO program that was working at 2 of our local high schools. And I happen to know that because TRIO was based at WSU Vancouver, is based at WSU Vancouver, but the high school counselors were already connecting the dots of, here's the resource that we can use from Fourth Plane Forward, here's the resource we can use from TRIO, Upward Bound. High school counselors are often a little bit more on top of that sort of thing. That's where I would start.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges is there is no like central resource really for identifying CBOs. Some are associated with professional organizations, but
yeah,
a lot of it sounds like it'll be word of mouth.
Yeah, and sometimes there are college fairs. I've also met some really great CBO folks at college fairs that might have their own table. Yeah.
I had a couple of comments just to throw in there, maybe for you to react to while we wait to see if there's any other questions. One comment I had was demographics are very important, but I think we need to remember demographics are not destiny. And
absolutely.
So, and the demographics may vary depending on the school you work at or the programs you represent. I have a couple of programs that I feel very comfortable going in and promoting to students from lower socioeconomic areas who may not be able to afford typically to go out of state because of just certain factors about those programs. While there are other programs, I'll be glad to share the information with those students, but I know it may not be as fruitful for me or for them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a
And
really good point. And I think that's why some of that data analysis is important too, right? If you can look at where students are typically enrolling at your institution, but if you are interacting with them one-on-one and you know that interest is there, what's missing? How can you be that advocate for connecting the dots between um, connecting the interest students might have in enrolling there with them actually doing so? I had a staff member who I worked with at WCU Vancouver who was fantastic at advocating for a specific scholarship. I'm not sure how far it's gotten, but trying to have a specific scholarship put in place to help first generation low income students who were doing running start, who could qualify for a scholarship based on their running start grades. And so that's where we could see that area of interest, but there really wasn't a scholarship to address that financial need. So maybe you could be the advocate to change those things at your institutional level.
another comment that I had in terms of the value of territory management, I think that gets lost a lot in today's world of admissions is if you're able to be handling the same territory for several years and begin to really learn the people within that territory, your effectiveness and efficiency are going to be multiplied. And maybe a related conversation is to not overlook, I think you touched on this, Erin, not overlook the fact that you can use high school counselors at one school to network with high school counselors in other schools. Yesterday, I visited a couple of schools where I was able to learn about new counselors or counselors at schools I had never been at before. Now I have a foot in the door with those schools that I have really had very little exposure to in the past.
Yeah.
But part of it is having credibility from having
that's what I
gone
was just gonna
back to
say.
those schools sometimes 3, 4, 5 times over the course of 5, 6 years.
Yeah, because you become a recognizable face. You're a trusted, known entity. And some of us have heard a trend of institutions that are just, and maybe this is because of turnover, but they don't have consistent territory. Their staff don't have consistent territories. And I can see that being a necessity in some cases, but I would hope it's not a strategy because because I do really feel like that long-term institutional knowledge and then territory knowledge strengthens the work that you can do with students, and the visibility and presence of your institution. And that's why I think it's, I'll always get on a soapbox about treating staff well, because when there's turnover, there's loss of relationships, loss of knowledge, and you really kind of have to start over again. And those of you who might be doing that right now know how hard that is.
Well, and I'll confess that when I was a director a couple of times, I struggled with the territories, partly because I was always very concerned about equity and fairness for my staff. And because of the location sometimes of where my institutions were, it was hard to do that. If I said to someone, hey, I want you to handle Chicago, and someone else, I want you to handle rural Illinois, those might be completely different workloads, completely different expectations of travel and so on. In reality, in retrospect now, as I think about it, being back in an admissions counselor role myself, I see that I really didn't do a good service to my staff with that. And I think if any of you who are in this audience right now don't have a territory, it may be a conversation you want to have, with your supervisor of, could you give me responsibility for this or that? I'd like to take some ownership over, this really type of student, that geographical area, because it might be that your supervisor doesn't get it or is, kind of, I don't know what word to use that's fair. But anyway, it's a conversation
Not be the top of their priority list. Yeah. Yeah. And actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is something that I experienced myself. I use the example of working with private high schools, and that was something I advocated for myself. I attended a private high school, and I was able to visit my alma mater every time I went back to Boise. But that experience, that personal experience that I brought to our team was unique. And so to say, I would like to work with private high schools to take the load off of my colleagues working with all the schools in Seattle, that was a pretty easy sell, right? And it was a way for me to learn a lot more about how the discrepancies between different types of high schools and student experiences.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, Erin, I'll say I think that was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
The fact that
Palmer.
there's no Q&A here means you must have just done it
Answered
to
all the questions.
perfection.
Or
But
everyone's just waiting with bated breath for that handout that we're going to send with all of these
absolutely.
questions to study. So yeah.
Well, I think part of this, you really gave us a lot to process. And so I think to stop and pause, be able to think through these things may take a little bit of time. But thank you so much. I also want to make sure everyone knows Erin's doing this when she's getting ready to go in for surgery tomorrow for a broken ankle.
Right.
We have no idea how drugged up she is right now.
Good thing you got me today.
But thank you for thank you for making sure your surgery was scheduled around our webinar
Absolutely.
series.
Exactly.
And we hope that all of you will join us again next month when we're going to be talking about self-care. We're at a time of year where you may be feeling tired and a little bit worn out. And actually, I've invited my supervisor, our director of admissions, Anaganya Haas from University of Alaska Fairbanks, to present on this, because I think she has a good handle, and I hope maybe she can give you some tools for taking care of yourself and advocating for yourself. So I hope you'll join us next month.
And I'll add to Palmer. I'm
Yes.
sure, I know some of you are already in the new Slack.
Thank you. Yes.
Channel,
Talk about that.
Talking about connecting with folks and asking questions specifically about territory management or really anything else. Palmer even has some questions like that in there right now. Have you been to this fair? Is this fair even happening? That sort of stuff. If you're not already in Slack, please do join. We want to get that conversation going and have that be a great resource for you all.
Please take advantage of your colleagues. I was at a college fair today with Riley, who's part of our audience, and we were, talking about, what are you doing at this college fair? Hey, there's a new counselor at this high school. Pick each other's brains. We're all on the same team. We're collaborating, and it's really a phenomenal profession because of that. So anyway, Get off my soapbox. Right.
Hey, Erin, when will this recording be available?
It will be available probably within the next 2-3 hours. So I'm going to say by tomorrow, but I'm going to do it today. So any of you who are in the Slack, you can actually just click on a link to go to the whole playlist for all of the videos for this session or the series. And then you're also going to get an email, I think it's 2 or 3 days from now, with a link to that playlist in there too. So just look for the most recent one. It won't be
Feel free to encourage your colleagues who haven't signed up for the webinar series to still register, and they can access this and other recordings as well as the future sessions. Yeah.
Great.
Awesome. Thank you very much, folks.
Thank you. Happy travels. Good luck.